our understanding of the problem of population increase and the impact on resources. We will hear 3 more lectures with local perspective. Those are selected aspects. And the first one will be Professor Dan Rabinowitz, or the American will say Rabinowitz. Dan is a professor in the Department of Sociology. He was the president of the Israeli Anthropological Association, held visiting professorships at Princeton, NYU, Central European University, and the University of Toronto. He is a member of the international scientific boards at various international scientific publications. Professor Rabinowitz served as the chairman of LIFE, an environment organization, the umbrella organization for environmental NGOs in Israel, and currently serves as the chairman of the Association of Environmental Justice in Israel and is vice chair of the Greenpeace UK. Over the years, he published many opinion editorial in our newspaper Haaretz, and is a regular participant in TV and radio shows in Israel and abroad. Professor Rabinowitz, please. He will tell us about the sacred cow of Israel, the environmental implication of Zionism population policy.
Thank you very much, Avital. As part of my responsibilities here in Tel Aviv University, I'm also a member of the management team of the Porter School of Environmental Studies, and I'd like to congratulate the Porter School as well as the Israeli Society for Ecology and Environmental Studies, Sciences, and the Blaustein Institute of Desert Research for organizing this important meeting. I'm also immensely honored to share this stage with Professor Ehrlich. And I must confess that having read your books and many articles as a teenager in the 1960s, and having been exposed to the immense consequences and influence that your work has had on Senate and House committees in the States, and the Club of Rome, and meetings in Stockholm, and the entire environmental process that we've all witnessed in the last 40 years, as well as on many generations of researchers and academics, I was expecting an old man. And instead, what we've just had is this impressive display of zest and rigor and conviction and enthusiasm, which in itself is enough to make some of the younger people in the room a little bit more optimistic about the coming decades of their biographies. It may have not been a very optimistic view, but few lectures on an environment and the environmental crisis these days are optimistic. For my part, I'm afraid that my contribution tonight would probably not be very optimistic, but might also be very awkward, at least for the Israeli members of the audience. Because what I would like to do is to juxtapose and maybe bring into conflict sets of values, mainly 2 sets of values that many of us hold dear separately. And when they are brought together, they, as I say, make us feel uneasy and maybe push us towards a debate, and maybe also, in some cases, towards conclusions that are not easy ones. So let me begin. I think that the problematic relationship that exists between hyper-consumerism, globalization, and the environment crisis has had its fair share of research interest and political and public attention in since the 1970s. More recently, environmental thinkers have been more and more prone to speak about the role of capitalism in setting the ideological, political and economic parameters that exacerbate the current crisis, not least through climate change, as Professor Ehrlich indicated. There is, however, I think, a dimension of modernity that consistently escapes attention, flying under the radar of generations of environmentalists. And that is the impact of nationalism, of ethno-national projects, and the concomitant dynamics of state-building efforts and state-building projects on resource use and by implication on sustainability. And this is what I would like to speak about. I think that the population policy in Israel, and probably its nemesis, that is the demographic vision driving Palestinians, are fascinating examples of this relationship. In both cases, the Israeli and the Palestinian, the ethno-national ethos, with its emphasis on security, endurance, and maybe most importantly on collective survival, assumes an emotive, inspirational life of its own. And that often flies in the face of more calculated, maybe more rational options that would maybe advocate population restraint and resource conservation in the interest of future generations. My working definitions will be as follows. When I talk about nationalism, I'm talking about the collective sense shared by many of belonging to a group representing a venerated past and a unified political future. State building, when I say, I mean the political process that seeks to turn national vision into a tangible political, territorial, and administrative plan or project. And when I talk about nationalizing project, these are the three terms I'm using: nationalism, state building, and nationalizing project. I'm speaking about a case of national state building that takes place when some of the fundamental issues, including the very membership in the project, who actually belongs to the people, or the territorial borders of the project, and the procedures through which control in it is claimed, declared and exercised, are still contested. So a nationalism project is a time and a period in which these issues, very important issues, who are the people and where are the borders and what kind of procedures would be made to assert claims, are still in flex. They have not been decided or have not been agreed. And my argument now can be reiterated that nationalism generally, and nationalizing projects of state building in particular, have an inherent, or might have an inherent tendency to use resources in uncalculated and often unsustainable ways. It's not deterministic, it doesn't have to be it, but I'm talking about a tendency. And I'll talk about population in Israel and Palestine as an example of this tendency. Struggles for ethno-territorial control are, by definition, urgent. They create a persuasive logic of their own, and they often tend to shadow other potential logics, including long-term viability. Urgency, which I reiterate is the key word here, is a very useful tool for hegemonic forces who set the scene for nation and state building projects. It creates, this urgency creates a vast space whereby heuristic measures, sometimes short-term measures, can be taken with immediate effect and can exclude, if only in order to exclude real or imagined competition from alternative claims, which always looms on the political horizon during a nationalizing project. So if we have to make a decision about population policy, the urgency of the nationalizing project can create a space in which hasty decisions can be implemented with consensus, because this struggle is still going on. Facts on the ground thus assume a magical, consensual value, and considerations that are beyond the tangible, predestined and overdetermined targets of the national project, as narrowly defined as it may be, can easily be swept aside. Zionism, if we look at the particular case of Zionism in Israel, Zionism and subsequently Israel have been a nationalizing project for at least a century now. The first decade of the 20th century, capped by the Balfour Declaration of 1917, marked if you like, a final departure from plans to solve the European Jewish problem elsewhere, Uganda, Northern Sinai, South America, and the strategic decision to concentrate on Palestine became consolidated, always in the presence of the counterclaims of an indigenous nation, Arabs, Palestinians. And the tension that ensued from this strategic decision and from the existence of alternative claims can be seen when we critically review a number of aspects of development policy. It largely determined, in the case of Zionism in Israel, the land regime, settlement patterns, water policies, energy, transportation, and many other infrastructural projects and infrastructural regimes that still govern, even now, 100 years into this project, much of the predicament of resource use in Israel and its future. But most of all, this urgency of the nationalizing project had an impact on what we are concerned with today, and that is the population vision adapted first by Zionism and later by the Palestinian National Movement. Within Zionism, the mission of transforming Palestine became the centerpiece of a unique and exceptionally successful project of nationalizing personnel, nationalizing people, making people into part of a nationalizing project. Immigration and pronatalism, Idudei Iludai in Hebrew, emanate from the nationalizing nature of the project. Zionism sees itself as responsible for two related battles: numeric dominance in Palestine, in Israel, and then in Israel, and the salvage of as many Jewish lives from diasporic perils and dangers on the other. So, speaking about the second, specific times of danger for diasporic Jews, quintessentially, of course, the Holocaust, but also anti-Semitism in Russia in the 1890s, upheaval in Iraq and in Yemen in the 1950s, more recently anti-Semitism in France and elsewhere in Europe, Argentina's economic crisis of 2000, Chernobyl of 1986, and so on. All of these are periodically and systematically and consistently lumped together in a very emotive narrative that suggests that the diaspora is inherently dangerous, while Israel is inherently safe. Other formulations of this equation could also be suggested. In reality, for example, since the establishment of Israel, more than 25,000 Jewish Israelis died as a result of hostility in Israel, while very few Jews died as a result of anti-Semitic hostility outside of Israel. This is since the state was began. But that's not my main point here. The main point is, and the outcome on the ground is that many millions, initially in Europe, but soon in other parts as well, assumed a new Zionist identity. Some actively moved to Palestine, later Israel themselves, and some became remote supporters of the very emotive and very powerful imperative to settle in Israel, thus facilitating the relocation of others. Israel-Palestine, including Gaza and the West Bank, now has a population of over 11 million. And this number is likely to double within 20 years or so. There are various models for this, for various populations, so I'm not saying it as a hard and fast number, but But this is a trend. Significantly, when we look retrospectively, the overall size of the current population is more than 5 times than it had been prior to the war of 1948. It represents a doubling rate on average of once every 11 years. Even though the first doubling of the population after 1948 in Israel took place within 13 years. The size of the Jewish population, which grew from 0.6 million to some over 5 million, a growth factor of 8.4, represents a doubling on average once every 6.5 years. On average. That doesn't mean that we should look for doubling in exactly these intervals. And I think 2 fundamental aspects of Zionism, which I've already alluded to, are salient here. One is the quantitative imperative, which defines the movement's immigration policy, and as a result, Israel's immigration laws. The law of return is a cornerstone, but it's not the only law that has implications on immigration and who may or may not enter Israel. So I'm saying it rather vaguely. It has an impact. This imperative has an impact on Israel's immigration law, and the imperative is quite simple. And this is where, when we look at it from an environmental point of view and from resource use and from a view for future sustainability, it might sound to us as, initially at least, immensely problematic. Bring as many immigrants, Jewish immigrants, as possible. No caps, no other considerations merit entry into this debate. This is the imperative, and to a large extent it has remained, as I indicate in my title, a sacred cow in Israeli public life, and even within Zionism. This is hardly ever contested and hardly ever debated, including within academia. A second, as I've hinted before, is that Israel has a relentless and very aggressive pro-natalist drive. It is premised on a robust ideology, which is very much in line with what I've said so far, and is also backed by a very sophisticated and effective battery of medical and administrative means to implement it. So it's been very successful. And by the way, it hasn't been specifically aimed only at Jewish families. And in fact, many of the measures are administered and used as incentives by Palestinian families to procreate as well. And this is something that was very, very significant in the 1960s and 1970s. Now rates of birth rates are going down in the Palestinian society. Now, if we talk about resource use, it is important to note that Zionism was and still is also powerfully linked to the modernizing mission of Europe, bringing progress to the dormant East, if you like, with development, technological development, and a constant growth and exponential growth in the standard of living, serving as a very compelling medium, almost a mantra or a fetish. And again, something that has been pursued with great success. If you look at growth rates of the Israeli economy, which is one indication, probably not the perfect one, but certainly an indication, we see staggering figures with average over decades, which are extraordinary. It's one of the only societies in the West where we have the two coupled. A very fast population growth together with a very consistent growth rate of the economy, raising standard of living and technology and consumerism. So I'm saying that an additional element of Zionism's nationalizing mission is its consistent vision of modern lifestyle. And this, of course, as I indicated, has important implication for resource use and sustainability at large. I will also mention here very briefly that modernizing and constant growth and an ever-increasing material standard of living was not the only option for the pioneers in Israel, as in other societies. Pre-state Zionism, for example, had a number of ideological subgroups who tended to identify with the local pre-modern lifestyle and culture of the Palestinians. They never were dominant, but they were there. Some of them also cultivated separately an impressive tradition of austerity. And the choice for accelerated and often indiscriminate modernization, industrialization, and a constant raising in standard of living was in no small part motivated by the subsequent nationalizing project of the state after 1948. And the constant need and desire of the nationalizing project to disassociate itself from the local, pre-modern, less developed Arab that is seen as living at a contemptibly low standard of living. So the result is that a combination that has become staple of Israeli and Zionist ideology, the vision of an ever-expanding Jewish community in Palestine, Israel, with an ever-modernizing, ever-growing lifestyle. The very formula that every budding environmentalist now recognizes clearly as the gate to unsustainability. It can work for a while, but it cannot work indefinitely. And especially when we now look at having not 11, but 20 million people or more living comfortably and independently in terms of food supplies and other resources on a tract with a total size of only 26,500 square kilometers, and I'm including the West Bank and the Gaza. People looking at this issue have indicated, like Hartman, for example, writing about the American context, that issues like population, immigration, pronatalism are very often debated and politicized in the context of looking at relationships between groups rather than at looking at a homogenized, unified population. So subdivisions are very important. This is not a managerial debate, or if we paraphrase what Hartman is writing about America, it's never an interesting debate when it is a managerial one, and it becomes heated and politicized and interesting only at times of great debate about immigration and about whether or not we want to include others, the role of ethnic groups within the larger population, and so on and so forth. I think this is the case here as well, or could be the case here as well. But paradoxically, or maybe not so paradoxically, I leave it to you to decide, it is the relevance of these issues to the very core, the very core issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has, I think, prevented it, the notion of population, immigration, pronatalism, and so on and so forth, has prevented it from entry into both the environmental debate but also the political debate in Israel. We hardly speak about sizes of population within the environmental debate in terms of the politics of it, or at all, and we hardly speak about relative sizes of population when we talk about the big politics of the Israeli-Arab conflict with reference to environmental resources. So the two debates may exist, but they do not cross paths. And there have been a number of, I would say, faint attempts to raise it and to introduce this issue into the environmental debate. I think notably Daniel Ornstein and Yaakov Garb have written about it in the last decade. But I think that those of us who know these attempts would agree that it's never sort of caught on. And the debate is still very stifled and is not, and as I said, it might have to do with the awkwardness of the issues that it brings up. Population is maybe the basic building block, but as I've said before, the same debate might, with similar political implications, with a capital P, implications might be held about the way agriculture is managed in Israel, about land regime and allocation, settlement, energy, transport, water infrastructure, and many other. All of them spheres where policy directly impacts resource use and chances of sustainability. And I would just say, just as a headline, that the Palestinians have recently been sucked into almost an exactly opposite position, in which population is seen, and population size, and of course the refugee problem that looms in the horizon, is seen as perceived as something that is beyond internal debate, and is associated, like a holy cow, if you like, a Palestinian holy cow, is associated with exactly the same issues of survival, longevity, and collective durability. For sometimes I've claimed that there is a fourth environmental paradigm now being in the making. The old three were romantic environmentalism, and the environmentalism that has to do with health, and more recently, environmental thought that has to do with equality and relations between groups in society. I think that the nexus between environmental thought and issues of survival and security is now being understood by more and more people, courtesy of climate change and the climate crisis. But I think that this is certainly a new way of using environmental thought and of seeing how relevant it is to the big issues of the world, including existence of whole populations. And I think that the case of population in Israel and Palestine is a case that exemplifies that very strongly. It is emotive, it is political, it is maybe over-politicized in certain arenas of the debate, both within Israel and within the Palestinians, but it is framed in a way, or has been framed so far, in a way that is at best narrow, partial, and inadequate. And I think that the environmental angle must be incorporated into this big issue of population and relative population size. I will not be presumptuous as to claim that the big issues of the Israeli-Arab conflict might be solved by applying environmental thought onto them, but I would say that a modest contribution from environmental thought can and should be expected. Thank you very much.